in middle school, and it was fierce. Like they don't wear shoes. The guys don't wear shirts. There's no pads, no anything. There's not really any kind of protection, and they there's so much that goes into it that beforehand. Like it's not just the game itself; it's a really spiritual thing. So they do some ceremony and stuff that like if you're not on the team, you don't even really get to deal with. And some people will say that so every team would have like a medicine man that's like kind of spiritual leader and kind of like what you would think of, I think, is like a coach. And people say, well, it's not even a game between the teams and their ability, but it's more of like which medicine man has better medicine, basically. And one thing I also loved is so every year we have a annual kind of festival fair, and it's over 100 years old now, this annual fair. And a big part of that is the stickball games between the communities, and that's it's always the first week of October, and it's really all about like bragging rights too between the communities. And but one of the cool things that I always love too is after the game, the teams will go to the river, basically right across the street, and like literally wash themselves clean of they call it going to water, but they like literally like go in the river, and then when they come out, they don't have any hard feelings or any kind of like grudges against any of the teams they've played or the people they've played. And it always blew my mind too, because for it to be such a rough game, there wasn't that many injuries. And so that kind of makes me really believe in kind of the spiritual and the kind of the medicine power that goes in behind it. And so it was really something that was just, honestly, I took for granted. It was something that was like kind of sacred to us. And then once I left the reservation, I saw like modern lacrosse. I was like, oh, well, this is like basically the formalized version and of what we kind of grew up with. And obviously, not all the traditions attached to it, but it's been so cool to see the guys from the Northeast, some of the Northeast tribes who kind of converted to playing traditional or the modern lacrosse, and the Thompson brothers and some of the other guys who have just been like powerhouse, and also using that platform to speak about how it is a traditional game. Because I know, as many of you probably know, it's kind of, for a lot of people, lacrosse is like Laxbro, white, rich, kind of seeing that in that perspective. And so it's been cool to see people like Paul Rabil and like the some of the leaders in lacrosse kind of really make this connection between the traditional indigenous kind of ways of lacrosse, and the fact that it is a medicine game. It is something that's like a spiritual celebration of life, really. So it's been really cool to follow. And I'll have to share it with you. I did for a part of my PhD, I researched stickball and how it was such a big cultural impact in Cherokee for our men and our women. And so I ended up doing kind of a short documentary, and it's actually going to be playing at the River Run Film Festival. That's kind of trying to think of where in North Carolina, but it's gotten to a few film festivals, and it's about kind of the women's perspective from the game and when they played when I was in middle school. And it was very controversial when the women played, because there were people who said like, oh, women should not be playing. And then there were people, some of our elders said that women were actually the first to play the game, and that when the people that came to America, the settlers came and saw women playing, they were like, that's barbaric, women shouldn't be playing. And that's how like kind of the colonization made the women stop playing. But traditionally women did play. So it was kind of a really interesting story to see the different perspectives about it, and just how kind of powerful and impactful kind of culturally it was to these women and to our greater community. So I'll share that with you guys, because it was really fun to make.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
How would you like to, you have some thoughts to share? I know they'll at some point, they have some questions as well. They've been preparing for that. Would you just like to share some of your thoughts?
Yeah. I was thinking too, I was like, I can ramble, so feel free to stop me at any point, but just to give you guys a little more kind of background. So growing up in Cherokee, it's a really tight-knit community, and it's funny because people would always ask like, well, what is it like growing up on a reservation? And it's like, I don't know any different, so I don't know, it's hard to like know how to explain it. But once I left and saw how other people's experiences were, I could kind of see some points of comparison. So the fact that we have a chief instead of like a mayor, and the fact that we have our own kind of tribal government systems, our own school system. There's so many things that we were really lucky, our own hospitals, our own, and of course, many of you probably have heard of the casino is a big part of our economy in Cherokee and Harrah's. And so there's so many other kind of little interesting different facets. But for me, what was so great about growing up in Cherokee was just how tight-knit the community was and how our families were just so close. Like it blew my mind when I met people at Tennessee who didn't know like who their cousins were, because I know all my cousins, and I know like I'm just like my cousins are kind of like my siblings, and so it's really just super tight knit. And then it's hard, and that's why a lot of people, they don't leave, and I think that's why reservations are kind of secluded, and they are or not, they're secluded for another reason, but they are, sorry, my light goes off, I don't move every couple minutes, but they're very kind of insular, and they are much like a bubble. They want to protect everyone within the community, and so it's really tough for folks to leave, and but when you leave though, and then there's a weird tension when you leave, like kind of a back and forth. But all my family's in Cherokee, it's, for me, it's been so empowering to think about how, because my ancestors basically, my great grandma, when they were doing the removal, the Trail of Tears, moving all of the people from the south, Cherokee people from the southeast to Oklahoma, she basically just hid out in the mountains of North Carolina, and they just refused to move, and because otherwise my whole family would be in Oklahoma or who knows where. And so that's been really empowering for me to think about and to reflect on, and just to know like kind of where I come from in that way. And so that's why I encourage people, like, even if I think DNA tests are kind of ridiculous, but just knowing kind of your family lineage and your family tree and where you've come from is so empowering. But going to the mascot piece, it's really interesting. That's been a really kind of a full circle thing for me, because growing up on the reservation, I remember very distinctly in 2005 when the NCAA implemented the rule around not having mascots at competitions. And there was a school in Asheville, my Asheville person might know this, Irwin High School, that they were the Warriors, and they were actually the Squaws, like, which is the women's were, and like squaws, like the C word. It's like a very derogatory term. And so I remember they were in the process of changing their name, and they actually came to Cherokee, and they were interviewing some of our students about like, well, should you guys change your name because you're the Cherokee Braves? And we were just like, well, we're all tribal, like we're all Cherokee. So, and we didn't see the harm in like the mascot and the kind of we even had like the cartoon, like big head, big nose, all that. Chief Winnemall was his name, not like the Braves Chief Nakahoma. So that was really kind of a funny sidebar. But yeah, it was like we didn't understand, because we were just like, well, and I think when you grow up in your community, you don't understand like people, that everyone knows you're Cherokee or knows your tribe, and it's not people aren't questioning your identity every day. And then when you leave, like me especially, being very white passing, people are like, well, you don't look native, or you don't look, and especially being Cherokee, I'm sorry, but I call it Generickie just because that's what everyone kind of like, that's kind of the go-to tribe that everyone goes to, especially being out here on the West Coast, because there's so many tribes with so many cool names, and when I tell people I'm Cherokee, they're just like, okay. But that's what really made me realize when I left, like, oh, people like, and even when I was at Tennessee, people were like, did you grow up in a teepee? And I'm like, I grew up 2 hours away from here. And it blew my mind that people still had that perception that we were basically either extinct or like cartoon characters. And so, but my whole thing when I was in college was like, well, we have bigger issues to deal with. We had, diabetes and drug abuse and alcohol abuse, for like, they're stereotypes, but they're kind of stereotypes for a reason, because they are really bad issues for a lot of tribal people. And I didn't make the connection then that that's a part of a bigger cycle of kind of like oppression and trauma, that it kind of links back to this idea of being dehumanized. And so when you're dehumanized, it's going to cause these mental issues that lead you to rely on drugs, alcohol, food, sugar, all that stuff. So it's like a cycle. And so it took me a very long time to like put that together. And it was a long time off the reservation. And so it was just blew my mind that people had these perceptions. And I don't think it's malicious for most people. I think it's so implicit. It's something that they don't even realize that they're thinking. And it makes sense too, because there's not a lot of Native people in, like, if it were for mascots, you may never see a Native, there's like Pocahontas and like what other kind of references are there out there. So it was such a small part of the population that most people don't have a real reference point to a Native person. I know I've been, for many people, I'm like one Native person that they know, that, or one person they like grew up on a reservation that they know. And it's so that's one of the big issues, is like just the visibility. And thankfully social media, and like you're saying, Dwayne, like the fact that you found me on Twitter, like the fact that like I'm able to have that voice through social media. And before it wouldn't have been trying, in the way that us as like Indigenous people can connect all across the country too, has been really a game changer. Okay, I know I'm rambling. I'm trying to think of what other points I was going to make. So yeah, so just really, being first, being like, well, that's, we have bigger issues to deal with, but actually this issue isn't really important. And I remember I started my PhD program and I was like, I'm not going to talk about mascots. I was just like so over it and I didn't want to deal with it. But then I realized like how important it is. And it literally is so complicated, because just like I said, like, should we change should our Cherokee Braves change ours? And ultimately I think they should all go, just because the damage to the overall kind of the whole is not worth it. And that's also why I've been kind of speaking out against the Braves and the Cleveland Indians. And because a lot of people, when the Washington football team changed their name, they were like, oh, well, we're done. It's good. We're done. We're we got rid of that like obvious slur, but it's like, no, actually, like, we need to take this a step further. And funny enough, so my grandpa is actually a huge Washington football team fan. Just because when he was growing up in North Carolina, we didn't have the Panthers yet. And they also had the same color scheme as our high school. So it was kind of an obvious, easy pick. And when I think for a lot of Native people, seeing some semblance, even though that that like obviously that's not what you look like, you're not wearing a headdress or have like a feather in your hair or whatever, but it's just like something that you can kind of latch on to, that sense of pride, and like you can kind of feel like ownership of it. And so and I'm not going to tell him not to be, like it's that's where it gets really hard and really tricky. And so when that happened this summer, I just honestly, I never thought it was going to happen. Because when people like Dan Snyder usually say something's not going to happen, like he says never, that means never. Like usually he gets his way. And the fact that people didn't realize too that there's been Native women especially protesting and bringing legal action against Washington's football team for decades. Like, it's not new. But the fact that all the kind of the civil unrest and all the stuff that's happened, social justice and this kind of racial, I hate this kind of cliche, like this racial reckoning that we've been having this past year. But the fact that people were really like waking up to these issues, and the fact when Washington football team, they did one of the black squares when everyone was doing the black squares on Instagram, and it's just like, do you realize like how like ridiculous you seem talking about like ending racism when your team name is a slur? And even when they came out with the release of like the changing the name, it was on like the Washington Redskins letterhead. It was like so just asinine. And so it's just, so there's so many points and there's so many PR things I've seen. I'm just like, they could really use to have be really benefited by having someone that's just somewhat aware of these issues. And so I'm gonna keep rambling, but I have a couple other things I just thought of. So one of the big points about mascots, right, was that people said, well, these are meant to honor Native peoples, but they started doing implementing mascots in like 40s, 50s, 60s, yeah, some even earlier. And at the same time, they were also sending Native children to boarding schools where they were basically stripping them of their culture and basically trying to convert them to the white man's ways. And the motto was kill the Indian, save the man. It was that, okay, we can, instead of just kind of completely doing genocide and erasing these people, let's actually try to convert them to kind of our ways of living. And so the same time they were sending kids away to boarding school, telling them, don't speak your language, don't do any of your cultural traditions, they were trying to say that, well, we were also putting these mascots into place to honor you. So that is where I kind of have mixed feelings about that argument. And for me, it's not even about, because I'm not easily offended. Like, it doesn't offend me to see those things, but it's just more about what it does to us as a society implicitly, and how it continues these cycles of just stereotypes and oppression and like the dehumanization is the big thing. And I started working with a couple of brothers down in Atlanta who are really fighting against the Braves and trying to get them to change their name. And that's a really tricky one too, because the Braves are actually working with my tribe, Eastern Band of Cherokee, and working with a couple of our chief and some of our tribal members. And but it's really divided our community because there's people who don't necessarily agree with that. And I think that's the big thing with a lot of sports teams is they try to say, well, we're partnering with the Native community. And then they never really say anything more about that. They never really talk about specifically who they're talking about with. And for me, it's like, they always say we're consulting or we're working with the tribe. And it's like, what would be really great is if you actually hired someone to be kind of your kind of, or maybe not just one person, but it's multiple Native people, actually hire us and employ us and do more of that work. And also do that work without having the mascot. I think every sports team should be really cognizant of the land where they are, because it's indigenous land wherever you are, and be doing some sort of outreach and be doing some sort of community service with the tribes and with the local kind of indigenous community, regardless if you have a Native mascot. And so the Braves one is really tricky. And I honestly lost sleep over the summer because I know the Braves went up to up to Cherokee and they shot this video, and it was all about we're still here. And they played it. They were going to play it in the stadium, but of course the COVID, there wasn't any fans in the fall. And but they posted it on their social media, and I was just looking at the replies, and it was just people were just celebrating because they're chop on. It was like they totally missed. It's like, okay, we have permission from this tribe, so we're good. We can still continue to do these really ridiculous racist things. And so that's when it kind of turned for me that people aren't gonna get that. As much as you try, I feel like sometimes try to educate folks, it's really hard to. People just want to have kind of that permission to be okay, we can own this mascot thing, and we have permission to kind of act ridiculously. And so Cleveland just recently they announced they're going to change the name of the Indians, but they also recently said that you can't wear any kind of headdresses or any kind of this Native American costume stuff to games, which also, I think it was Kansas City Chiefs that did it earlier this year too, or I think it was late last year. And it's if you're having to tell your fans not to be fans and not dress in a certain way, I think that tells you everything you need to know. It's it just would make so much more sense to change the name, especially professional teams. I just think such a cool marketing opportunity there to really not only changing the name and having people come up with the rebranding, but also just the goodwill and the after effects and all the new merch you can sell. There's so many opportunities there, and they're not going to go away. There's always going to be that kind of this. I feel like everything's going to be retro. People are going to really hang on to those things, so it's not going to you're going to completely erase it anytime soon. But I feel the professional teams have the least amount of excuses because they have the least amount of resources to actually make those changes. but yeah, the whole like we're consulting with Native people and they don't really tell you who it is, and then it's like basically they get a Native person to sign off and give them permission, and it's like, okay, we're done. And the other thing about my tribe too, that with working with the Braves, well, it makes sense because the Braves are kind of in Cherokee territory. I also think that it shouldn't just be my tribe that benefits from that relationship. I think as a whole, and that was what ultimately led me to speak out, was like, as a whole, I think it hurts the indigenous community more than just what our tribe benefits from it. And and they've done some really great things. They've raised money. They sold some T-shirts with our traditional syllabary language on it, and raised money for our kind of revitalization of our language fund. And so that's great, but at the same time, I think the greater harm is not worth it in the long run. So a lot of rambling, sorry, but hopefully there was some good stuff in there.
Natalie, in that same vein that you're talking about, without doing a deep dive into the research of like the Florida State Seminole and their relationship with the Seminole tribe, it has the appearance that they have a quote unquote good relationship with the tribe, and yet there's still some very offensive imagery that they choose to use, down to their, booster clubs being called the headhunters and just things like that. So what role does money play? And is there a financial relationship between Florida State to the tribe that maybe there's more offense than they're willing to communicate, but this check is coming? Is that even true that stuff like that exists?
Yeah, no, I've heard for as long as I've been working, like talking about and learning about mascots, I've always heard that they have a like financial benefit. Because early on I was like, well, like good for them, I was like, that's so great that they can make money off of that. But people don't realize there's a Seminole tribe in Oklahoma that doesn't get any of the benefits, and they don't see any of that, and they don't want the Florida State to be using that mascot. And so again, it shows you that like just because like one tribe, or even like that's the thing too, is like, it's a lot of times the leadership that are making these decisions, and we all don't always agree with leadership, and I think people try to kind of, I think this happens with every minority group, but you try to get one person to speak for more than a whole group, and that is really problematic. And I do think the money part, but what's funny to me is like, I think there's just so much money to be had if they were to actually like rebrand. And but then I think the college level is hard because the donors are very adamant oftentimes and attached, and it blows my mind when people kind of use the tradition, like, oh well, this is our tradition, and it's like, do you know what like the history of Native people in this like country are? Like, it's like, oh, I'm sorry that you've been doing this for 30 years, but do you know that my ancestors have been oppressed for like hundreds in this country since its founding? And it's like that whole tradition thing kills me. And it's like, okay, guys, we can find a new tradition. Like we'll be okay. And it's just kind of, I think it again speaks to the fact that sports fans are just a little bit crazy, like fanatic in us. And also too, like that's what I also get really frustrated when there's like this divide. It's always a binary, right? It's like you're an activist speaking out about mascots, but you're not a sports fan, so you don't understand sports and like how sports work. But it's like, no, actually, I'm a fan of the Braves. Like I want, like as an organ, like they were kind of like the closest team to us in Cherokee, and but I also want them to change the name. Like you can be both. You can be a fan and also not necessarily agree with everything that the team does. And I think a lot of us are caught in that kind of weird space. And they've often framed this as like, well, the Native activists and these Native radicals versus sports fans. And it's like, well, no, like it's not that simple. There's a real big, there's also often a crossover. But yeah, going back to your question, I've always heard that the Seminole tribe's gotten money from that relationship. The Seminole tribe of Florida, but not the Seminole tribe of Oklahoma. And most people have no idea that there's that other tribe that doesn't get those benefits.
actually had a question as well.
Yeah.
So when looking at college versus pro sport, do you see one or the other doing it better than the other, kind of paying homage or kind of receiving more pushback to changing or and rebranding? I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think professional, they just that you often have so many more resources. Like, there's just so much more money to be had there, and there's I feel like a greater visibility for a lot of professional sports teams in the areas that they're in, and so I think that's a really really big benefit. Like the Chicago Blackhawks are one that are often really adamant, and like we have a relationship with the tribe, and we do all these things, and it's great that they do that, but at the same time, it's like you could do this stuff without the mascot. Like you could still do, your land acknowledgement. You could still do your kind of they have a native veteran always come in and do the national anthem. You could do all this stuff still. Like you don't have to, like, who says you have to have a mascot to do this stuff? So I think that's the big thing. It's like realizing like we should be doing this stuff anyways, like every team should, and as a society we need to just kind of get a little bit more kind of cognizant of where we are in the land that we're on and the people that were before us. And then college, the college is hard just because North Dakota was another case that I just always remember. The donors were just so adamant. They had one major donor who basically paid to have like the kind of the Indian head kind of like emblazoned into all of their facilities, like into like the ground, like into kind of this weird like kind of metal stuff, and like basically making it impossible. Like they tried to like tear up every facility to like remove all these monikers, and he was very adamant about like, if you ever change the name, I'm not donating anymore. And so that makes it even more more difficult when you're having to deal with that, whereas pro teams don't really have to answer to that. But I'm trying to think of other examples. The North Dakota one is just wild because like the stuff that donor did to like make sure that it was a fighting Sioux, make sure that kind of remained, was just kind of ridiculous. But I do think the pro teams too have done a better job with connecting with the Native community just in general. Oftentimes, I don't know, not always maybe the best intentions, but just kind of like kind of this getting permission thing. But colleges overall, not just athletic departments, but just universities and colleges, I think they all need to do a better job of being kind of more just aware of the Indigenous community where they are, because there's Indigenous people everywhere. Like it's not just in certain areas, but it might take a little bit of work, but and it is hard. Like I'm out here in Oregon, and we have a tribe that's probably about 30 miles west of us, and there's not really been much of a relationship, and it's like it takes a lot of work. It takes people that are actually willing to like kind of get outside of their bubble of the college or the university and like actually go out to the tribe, go out to the reservation, go out and like work with these people. So I definitely think the pro teams have at least done a leg up there with the resources, for sure. Good question. I thought of another point too when I was earlier. So the other thing that kind of bugs me about mascots is it completely kind of erases Native women. It's always kind of a male figure. There's never like a female figure, and even when the squaw incident, and there was a ski resort. I can't remember exactly where it was, but there was a ski resort recently, like it was Squaw Valley, and they're kind of changing the name of their resort, and so there's kind of that whole side of it too.
I noticed recently that a headline came up with the Jeep Comanche. Does that kind of name and imagery outside of sports also take a similar view?
Yeah, it's that one's interesting because I've seen all the people who are like, well, we should just change every Native name, everything, but it's like no, actually, like I don't mind, place names, street names, all those things obviously makes sense, but when you're profiting off of a name, like the fact that I'm honestly pissed that Cherokee hasn't been making money off of Jeep Cherokee. Like the fact that that name and that brand, we haven't been able to make anything off. Like they've been profiting off of that for decades. Is really like, man, that's a really missed opportunity. But yeah, it is, and because again, it continues that dehumanization. It's like, because people, when they hear Cherokee, they think of like a Jeep instead of like an actual person or an actual tribe, right? And so I think that's the issue with that, is that it again continues that erasure of the actual people. And so that's been a really interesting one to follow for sure. And I definitely think that's something they could reconsider, because again, it's this, you don't honor people by like a car name, like, and it's, you think about other car names just like you think about other mascot names, and they're kind of just like, they're not, current in living individuals. Like there's not, it's a really weird, like there's the kind of like the more abstract, and I'm all about like mascots and things being fun. Like I'm a big fan of Gritty and like all the ridiculous things they've been doing with that, and I'm like, it should be fun, it should be ridiculous, it shouldn't be a people. And one of the points that one of the really big prominent advocates against mascots has always made is that, because people are like, well, what about like Vikings, and what about all these other like kind of kind of human based mascots? And it's like, well, the thing about Viking is that we have plenty of white men in our world to make us like aware that not all white men are Vikings, right? We don't have any really, there's not a huge Native population or Native representation for other people to have another reference. And plus Vikings are not really, that's not a ethnicity or race or an exist kind of a current thing. So that's another really good point that I always appreciate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions, Emma?
There was like different sports organizations like the Braves or like just high school and middle school sports that have the name as Indians or Warriors and things like that. Do you think that like it would be better to just get rid of all those mascots completely, or to build that relationship with that tribe?
Yeah, I think get rid of them, but also build the relationships. Like do both. Like get rid of them and also try to like repair and like build a relationship and build some sort of initiative. Like for schools, I think there should be, especially universities, there should be programs where you get like tuition remission and like just programs where you get scholarships and things to be able to come to the university. For like the high school and the middle school and the elementary school level, it's just, that's such a formative age for kids and their thinking. And just like we shouldn't be teaching the kind of the Thanksgiving myth of like pilgrims and Indians, there shouldn't be the mascots. There should be more. And I know Oregon has really done a lot around revising their like elementary, middle school history around Native peoples. And so I think that's where there really has to be the change. And I understand too how hard it could be for elementary, middle school, high schools to change, because that is a huge cost. Like especially sports teams, right? Like high schools, they all have money sitting around to get brand new uniforms and all this brand new branding. But I do think they should change ultimately. And a lot of it's really, I have a Google alert for kind of the mascot issue, and I get and it's just, I love seeing every day. It's like a new state is coming up with like some sort of regulation around it. But I do think if a state is going to try to make a regulation, they should provide support too. If it's a public state school, like, well, if they're going to make you change, you should also provide support to help them do that. Because it's not going to be complete. It's not free. It's not easy. It's not cost free. But yeah, thanks, Emma.
I did have kind of a follow-up to Emma's question. And I think the group in here, as they were looking at the Catawba Indian name, is there a mythical creature such as the phoenix that you see institutions have. Is there something that would be close that wouldn't yet be offensive, or does that even exist, or does that touch on the spiritual side of the tribe, and that would be something to stay away from as well?
Yeah, I really like that, to be honest. Like something that is kind of more fictional, but like because we have really cool creation stories. Like we actually the first kind of lacrosse, the first stickball game that we had was they talk about it being a game between the birds and the like the animals and the like kind of and it's kind of like one of those like children's fables where it's like, oh, the little strong bird can still be successful, and those kind of things. So I could see there could be some sort of cool like animal, like, or even like I said, like a mythical creature. But again, trying to make sure it's still kind of can't be completely appropriate. Like it's not going to lead to like feather, crazy feather headdress stuff, kind of seeing there's kind of that fine line. But I could see that definitely being something that could be useful. And like I almost like how some schools too have like Auburn has like the war eagle, but they also have the tiger, and it's like, so you can kind of like get a little bit ridiculous with the tiger side, and then like the war eagle is kind of more of like the historic kind of actual like creature. But yeah, I think that's an interesting one for sure.
I know when the students presented last semester, we had the vice president in here, and because again, it's something there that is at least being considered, and it's something I learned from him. I guess we at our football field we had a totem pole, and then he done his homework and said, yeah, the Catawba Indian Nation did, like, that's not even something that they have in their own tribe, and so here was these associations that weren't even accurate, and again, nobody had done the work, right? And so he was in the process of doing the work. When they made some updates to the field, they were like, okay, this is a bad connection because it doesn't exist within the very tribe that we're representing.
Right. And like just like how the big headdresses, like that's a Plains tribes thing. That's not, most tribes don't have headdresses, and it's not, and plus it's it's supposed to be very honorable, like only certain people, it's not supposed to be a costume. And it's like just it blows my mind every Halloween too. It's like, oh, here we go. Here we go again. Because it's just this whole thing is like, we're not a costume, like we're not a a cartoon character. And it is funny. It's funny though. I'm wondering if people have seen where the Land O'Lakes got rid of the butter, or got rid of the lady on the butter. And it's just like, where did the lady go? It's kind of like a funny joke that we've been all making. It's like, oh, they got rid of, but it's but that's the kind of stuff. And like the kind of the same vein, I think that was like around the same time they were getting rid of like Aunt Jemima and some of the other Uncle Ben and like some of the other kind of just like, it's just like some of the stuff I think in 10 years when I look back and be like, how was that ever a thing? Like how did that ever exist in the 2000 year 2000s? But yeah, the knowing, because that's the thing too, is like our tribes and our people, like even our Eastern Cherokee versus our Western Cherokee, like our language dialects are different, like, and it's just that kind of education. So if it can be kind of a learning moment, like for Catawba to like do something that's kind of connected to the the traditional Catawba people, and like, but yeah, I think that's a really great learning opportunity.
Well, we are so thankful for your time with us today. They've got we're right up against the wall here, but I'd love to stay in contact and keep this dialogue going. We teach a sociology of sport class.
Yeah.
Entire week on name images, and it's a powerful week. And so I'd love to just stay in contact and definitely stay connected about your grad program. And then we can do definitely share anything and everything. I love that about our industry.
Yeah, I just appreciate everyone being so willing to listen and engage and ask questions and introduce yourselves. And it's really great to visit. It's really great to hear those North Carolina accents. It makes me feel good. Everyone makes fun of me out here, but it's great.
Get to come back. How often do you get to come back to North Carolina?
Well, I would normally come back like normally every kind of like holiday season, and I didn't make it out obviously this holiday with COVID, but I'm looking forward to coming back this summer to visit family and stuff. That's the hardest part. I love the West Coast, but it's really hard to be away from family. So
Well,
yeah.
if you get coming through Charlotte, Salisbury, please look us up. We'd love to have
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, appreciate it. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, guys.